This is a story of dirty business at the birth of moving pictures. I first came across it by accident while viewing a house in Leeds. The owner was full of some tale that the inventor of moving pictures had once lived there. I didn't believe a word of it. But he showed me the land deeds. The name Le Prince meant nothing to me. Then he told me that the man had been murdered by Thomas Edison. I was hooked. I'd always thought that moving pictures had been invented by the Lumiere brothers, or Edison, or Frieze Greene. But he was right. A slim book in the local library alleged that a Frenchman called Le Prince had invented moving pictures in Leeds in the 1880s. It turned out that a plaque commemorating Le Prince's work had been unveiled in Leeds in 1930. The inventor's daughter was present. Marie Le Prince had sailed from New York specially for the event. She brought her father's 2 surviving cameras with her.
My lords, ladies and gentlemen, I have been looking forward to this day for the last 40 years, and it has come none too soon. I am here as a witness from America to tell you that my father invented moving pictures here in Leeds. Le Prince's vision of moving pictures was far-reaching. Often he commented that films would talk and have color. He also said that film would change politics and governments. It is a great pity that his ideas became known to more people than was desirable. I often heard my mother say that there were those who wanted to forestall him. He told her that he was watched during his experiments. And I understand that his workshop was entered and parts were taken away after his disappearance. My mother was convinced that he was forcefully removed by agents of the American inventors.
In 1888, Augustin Le Prince made a number of short moving pictures in Leeds. Within 2 years, Le Prince had constructed a working projector. By 1890, he was ready to sail for New York, where his family had been preparing a venue for the world's first public showing of moving pictures. Shortly before he was due to leave, Le Prince made a brief trip to France to clear up some business with his brother who lived in Dijon. Le Prince left Dijon on September the 16th, 1890. His brother saw him onto the 2:39 afternoon train to Paris. Le Prince never arrived in Paris. He was never seen again. Detectives from 3 countries were hired to search for him. No trace was ever found.
On Heart of the Mid-South, a 100-year-old mystery has brought a British film crew to Memphis, and Nancy will tell us about it. Nancy?
I will. Who invented the motion picture camera? Well, if you answered Thomas Edison, you'd get a good grade in school, but you may not have had the right answer. This is the home of William LaPrince Hiddle, and that middle name is what's important. William LaPrince Hiddle is the great-grandson of Augustine LaPrince.
Yeah.
Yeah, they go back way
I
back.
think 3 men came out at night and forced him out on the runway, on deck, and threw him overboard.
I do think that maybe they were all together in it and they did throw him overboard.
Who's they? We're all together in it.
Edison.
Flamed her out.
Talk about.
Well, I think our great-grandfather's disappearance has always remained a mystery, but I'm sure they must have been hit people in those days. I don't particularly think it might have been just Edison, and it may not have been that at all, but that's our suspicion.
When we used to hear fairy stories about Jack and the Beanstalk or Goldilocks and 3 Bears, we'd also hear this story of LaPrince and the camera and the disappearance and Lizzie's faithfulness.
I think it hit me most of all one night when I was watching a late movie. And it was either a British production or an early Hollywood production about the invention of the camera and the mechanism.
The magic box, I think.
Did your Mr. Freeze-Green really invent it?
Yeah, of course he did. Lots of other things, too. You'd be amazed at all the patents he's got. He's a crack.
And I remember I was sitting there by myself. I was probably about maybe 16 or 17. And I remember all of a sudden, like, the child in the movie was talking to her father.
But you did invent the moving pictures, didn't you, Father?
Yes, I think I did. I wasn't the only one.
And he mentioned about 3 or 4 names.
Mine was the first patent.
And then LaPrince came through there.
There was a Frenchman called LaPrince a year or so before me.
And I remember I just shot up and I couldn't believe it. And from that time, then I knew that somewhere in the family that there was some importance to his work.
But the encyclopedia. You said it didn't even mention your name. It said that Edison invented them.
By the time Thomas Edison was 50, he was the living embodiment of the American dream. In the eyes of the world, this great man had transformed modern life with his countless inventions. His industrial vision had made light bulbs, phonographs, electricity itself available to millions. One December day in 1908, Edison threw a banquet for a dozen of the most powerful movie men in the United States. For the past 10 years, he'd been fighting most of them in the courts, claiming that he was the sole inventor of moving pictures. Over the meal, they toasted a truce, which gave them total control of moving pictures in the United States. Then Edison rose to speak. The motion picture art was created by me when I completed my camera in the summer of 1889, he told them. It made possible for the first time the securing of a permanent photographic record of a scene including movement, something never before accomplished. By accepting this claim, everyone present gained a share of the new monopoly.
No doubt the man was a genius, but he did have laboratories.
And the money.
The money, he just had scientists working under him and so forth, and he is one of the United States' greatest heroes. And I think it was just an automatic assumption. Nobody looked any further than Edison when Edison touched anything.
So this story of LaPrince has been lying dormant for years.
I think it only was in the circle of the people sitting at this table that any interest in LaPrince at all
They put that plaque on the leads.
Golly, that was back in the 20s, wasn't it?
Yes,
The 30s?
it's been a long way
I
back.
remember that.
Le Prince's descendants had more than just memories. They had documentary evidence. His widow's unpublished memoirs had been lying in this Memphis attic for the previous 50 years.
6 or 7 years ago, I started on the family tree. And of course, the most logical one to go to was Gigi. Gigi pulled out the trunks and the boxes. About the third box we went to, we found Lizzie's memoirs. They're quite brittle condition.
The missing chapters in the history of moving pictures. The life story of Augustin Le Prince, inventor of moving pictures, with letters and affidavits by Sarah Elizabeth Le Prince.
Do you remember her writing those?
Oh, yes. I was in college, and I saw her every evening after I got home. And she'd be writing in her book. She wrote every opportunity she had, every
to put
day.
on record a true and attested account of the first moving picture machines.
And her daughter would type them.
Augustin Le Prince was born at Metz in France in 1841. His father was a major in the service of Louis Philippe. Le Prince received the classical and scientific education that was customary for sons of French army officers, and later studied chemistry and optics at Leipzig. He also trained as a painter, so from the beginning he was both artist and scientist. In 1866, he came to Leeds at the invitation of my brother, who had met him in Paris. This is how I met him.
This is a painting of his love, Lizzie, done by Augustin Le Prince. She was a lovely, lovely young woman.
Le Prince became a partner in my father's firm, Whitley Partners. The firm manufactured components for the local steam locomotive industry. This experience gave Le Prince the grounding in engineering and draftsmanship which was to serve him so well later on. Le Prince first became interested in moving pictures on our wedding journey when he saw Houdin's dissolving magic lanterns in Paris. He was always fascinated by optical toys. But it wasn't until we moved to New York in 1882 that he decided to do something about it. We emigrated to New York to open an interior decoration business. It was the failure of this scheme which finally persuaded him to do something about moving pictures. He was manager of Poilpot's famous cyclorama at the time. The sheer scale of those great battle scenes was an inspiration to him. He told me that he wanted to animate them. He wanted to make a moving panorama in 3 dimensions. This was the aim of his first moving picture experiments. Le Prince made his first working models in the workshop of the school where I taught ceramics. This was in 1885, long before Edison thought of the idea.
What do you remember of Lizzie and Marie's relationship?
very, very devoted to each other. Her daughter just gave her whole life to taking care of her mother. Lizzie loved her garden, and her favorite things to plant were scarlet runners and bright red geraniums. She said they cheered her up.
I brought this strain to America with me from Leeds years ago. Trick is to root them at the right time of year. Then they'll survive anything. Marie?
Do you think Marie would have liked to have married?
I should think so. Doesn't every woman?
Don't you think it's time we had tea? It must have been sometime in 1885 that Le Prince decided to offer his invention to Edison. It was thoughtless of him. Luckily, he bumped into a friend on the way who strongly advised him not to do so. It's 4 o'clock. What on earth can she be doing? Marie, bring the Leeds china. Mr. Edison steals. He says so himself. He reads other men's patterns for pleasure, then takes what he wants from them. It was after this Edison incident that my husband decided to work on his invention in absolute secrecy.
I certainly wasn't allowed to see what he was doing.
One night you did, though.
It was a winter evening, and Father was late for dinner.
I sent you across to the workshop to call him.
I must have been about 14 at the time. I remember walking across the yard toward a flashing light. My father must have heard me because suddenly the door opened and there he was, standing over me, demanding to know what I wanted.
What do you want? What are you doing here? Now go home.
While the door was ajar, I saw figures on the wall. They appeared to be moving about. I didn't know what it was at the time, but I must have been the first girl ever to see moving pictures. He was very secretive. This is a part of one of my father's early moving picture machines. He intended it to double as a projector.
It has 16 lenses.
One of the reasons it's so complicated is because my father couldn't find a suitable film material for projection.
Your father used celluloid, Marie.
He did eventually, but not at first. He had to make do with other materials instead, like these, which were really far too heavy and fragile. Imagine moving these through a projector at a rate of 16 a second. Apparently, that's what a simpler, single-lens apparatus would have required, and it just wouldn't have stood up to the strain.
Oh, if your brother was still with us, he'd explain it properly. He understood it. You see, my husband realized he'd have to project the pictures at least 6 times a second.
16, Mother.
16 times a second in order to reproduce movement. He'd studied optics.
This number of lenses enabled my father to move these heavy things through the projector much more slowly. That's why it's so complicated.
That wasn't the only reason, though.
The other reason for all these lenses was that my father intended the camera to take stereoscopic...
We prefer not to talk about that. It's his secret, and we keep it. There
There were people trying to obstruct him from the very beginning. They refused him a patent at first.
They said it had all been done before.
They said his machine was nothing new, but it was. Someone was interfering. Someone in cahoots with those Washington officials.
They cited Edward Muybridge. And it's true, my father was inspired by his work.
Muybridge's goal was completely different, Marie. He didn't set out to make moving pictures.
Father would have acknowledged Muybridge's influence on him, Mother. And Monsieur Mary's, and many others. He wasn't the first to have the idea.
He was the first to succeed, though. My husband is a fair man. He gives credit where credit is due. Not like some we could name.
I don't think the patent office people understood what he was proposing. That was the problem. But he insisted and went down to Washington in person to spell out exactly how his invention differed from Muybridge's.
But they still ummed and ahed. I remember when he got back, he was very depressed.
He said there were strange things going on.
As soon as my father got to hear of it, he wrote immediately, offered him the use of his brass foundry back in Leeds so that he could perfect his machine in secret. He even offered him some capital. He recognized his novelty. We were in no position to refuse. I didn't want him to go, but he said he must.
My brother, Adolf, went with him as his assistant.
I was heartsick at splitting up the family, but we all thought it would be for the best.
In May 1887, after a 5-year absence, Le Prince arrived back in Leeds to work full-time on his invention.
My father's brass foundry specialized in the manufacture of steam governors and valves. This expertise proved invaluable for Le Prince when it came to solving the mechanical problems of his moving picture machines. At first, we thought he'd only be away for a year. Then 1 year became 2 years. It was then I learned he was having problems with the 16-lens camera and had decided to make a different machine. He thought it would take at least another year. It was a new camera. This camera. It has a single lens, which, because it films from one point of view only, gives a much steadier picture. Within a few months, he perfected a projector to go with it. It had taken him 3 years, but at last he'd succeeded. Suddenly it seemed as if all the pain of our separation had been worthwhile. Late in 1889, my husband sent my son Adolf back to New York to help me prepare a venue for the world debut of moving pictures. I chose the Jumel Mansion at 168th Street. The house was in a state of decay, so I agreed to restore it in lieu of rent. It had been George Washington's headquarters during the Revolutionary War. The ghosts of dead soldiers were said to roam its corridors. There was even a secret passage, which I had bricked up. We renovated that place from top to bottom in preparation for Le Prince's return. It had a large room, which Washington had used as his council chamber. It was ideal for the showing of moving pictures. Just before my husband was due to sail for New York, he accompanied Mr. and Mrs. Wilson, friends of ours from Leeds, on a short vacation to France. He travelled with them as far as Bourges, then left them to visit relatives in Dijon, while they spent a few days in Paris. He stayed 3 days in Dijon. When the day came for him to leave, his brother Albert saw him off at the station. He was reputedly in very good spirits, full of joking and laughter. In Paris, the Wilsons were waiting for him. When he didn't arrive, they took the night boat for England, assuming that he'd been held up unexpectedly. A few weeks later, I had a message from my brother to watch incoming steamers. So for days on end, Marie and I visited every shipping office and checked the passenger lists. I assumed that he'd been detained in Dijon to discuss the settlement of his mother's legacy with his brother. But when steamer after steamer arrived without him, I cabled and wrote for news. No one had any. Departing at Dijon on September the 16th was the last time anyone had seen him. Soon after Le Prince's disappearance, a friend told me he'd seen a most extraordinary announcement in the newspapers. Mr. Edison was about to give the world a sensational new invention. It was my husband's invention of moving pictures. My husband had always told me that if anything went wrong, I should go and see a lawyer friend of ours, a Mr. Stewart. So next morning, I got out my husband's patents and I took them to show Mr. Stewart, trusting that he would take up our case against Mr. Edison. When I got to the office, a clerk told me that I couldn't see Mr. Stewart. When I asked why, I was told that he was in court, engaged on a case for Mr. Edison. Mr. Stewart knew about my husband's invention. He'd seen the first models during the early trials in New York. Suddenly everything was clear.
We agreed we wouldn't use the word kidnapped, Mother.
There's no other word for it.
He pays lawyers to look out for this kind of thing.
I don't say who by.
It's obvious who you mean, and it's libelous.
I merely say by agents of the American inventors. People can draw their own conclusions. Next day, I went to the police. I showed them a photograph of my husband, and I told them of my suspicions. They refused to take up my case. I was told I must first accuse him of a crime, so that they could post a photograph of him in the rogues gallery. Just a formality, they said. The officer in charge suggested desertion. Desertion? My husband was probably murdered, and I must first accuse him of desertion? I couldn't do it. I wouldn't betray him.
We had to hire our own private detectives.
It was hopeless.
They followed every lead, but nothing turned up.
My husband was an honorable man. He fought for his country in the Franco-Prussian War. He would never betray me. They murdered him.
What really made us suspicious was that up to the disappearance, there were no moving picture machines to speak of. But after that time, patents just seemed to keep on coming.
And they all seemed to follow his principle.
We were powerless to do anything. Under New York state law, if a person disappears, 7 years must elapse before they can be deemed legally dead. Only then does their property pass to the next of kin.
It's a cruel law.
It applied to my father's patents.
We had to wait 7 years before we could take any kind of legal action against Mr. Edison.
These were beloved Point Woods, which was a beautiful little lane in the back that had worlds of blueberries and things, and she just loved that. And this is Lizzie in her favorite place at the cottage, a little bay window where she could look up and down the boardwalk and see her friends going by.
When I see that, it's almost as if she's looking out to sea, waiting for him to come back.
She used to say that Point of Woods was the closest she could get to England. And so she loved to be there all the time.
Do you think she held out hope that one day he would return?
Well, I think she was always hopeful. Otherwise, she never could have held on with all that she went through.
Who did she suspect?
She didn't suspect anybody at first until Mr. Edison came out with the same camera.
A few months after LaPrince's disappearance, Edison patented his kinetoscope. This was when Lizzie became suspicious. In fact, Edison was rather half-hearted about moving pictures at first. He regarded them as little more than an amusing toy. Others felt differently. As the new miracle caught on, it became clear that there were fortunes to be made. True to form, Edison now staked his claim to be the sole inventor of moving pictures. In a series of quick-fire legal actions, he drove his competitors from the business, but he met his match with the American Mutoscope Company. Mutoscope were captivating American audiences with their newsreels. Underwritten by the dollars of a large trust company, they were determined to dig in and fight. The war of the patents had begun. In order to win against Edison, Mutoscope had to prove that others had invented moving pictures before him. After meticulous research, they found that the pioneering work of several inventors predated Edison's claim. The list included men like Muybridge, Marey, Friese Greene, and LaPrince.
In 1898, my son Adolf was approached by the lawyers of the American Mutoscope Company to testify on LaPrince's work in their defense against Edison. Adolf had worked alongside my husband in Leeds. He was familiar with all the technicalities. So we decided he should give up his studies and devote himself entirely to the fight against Edison. I was suspicious of these people at the time. We should have had our own lawyers, not depended on other people's. I knew it was a mistake, but Adolf insisted on going ahead with it.
My brother returned to Leeds to gather evidence.
I hoped he'd bring back news of LaPrince.
It was a clandestine journey. He changed his name in case Edison decided to have him followed. He even arranged to wire us in code.
Edison had spies in Western Union. It wasn't worth the risk.
He didn't find Father.
But he brought back the cameras.
One winter morning, 8 years after LaPrince's disappearance, Adolf LaPrince took a cab down Broadway to the offices of Mutoscope's lawyers, convinced that recognition for his father's achievement was imminent.
Morning, Mr. LaPrince. Well, bring the camera along. No. 16-lens camera. We don't want to exhibit the single lens.
He took both the single and 16-lens cameras with him.
Very heavy, huh?
The Mutoscope lawyer advised Adolf to leave the single-lens camera outside the hearing. The hearing began on December the 7th, 1898.
Are you the son of Augustin LaPrince, patentee of U.S. patent number 346247?
Yes.
Did your father reside in New York in 1886 at or about the time when the application for this patent was filed?
Yes.
How long did he remain in this country at that time?
Until the middle of April 1887.
And are we to understand that the 16 shutters were operated by electromagnets and armatures controlled by a circuit closer?
Yes.
Did you assist in the making or using of this apparatus?
I was his assistant in Leeds. I helped him take pictures with it.
Now, if this camera...
Objection. This apparatus is a plurality of cameras. It has many lenses.
Overruled, Mr. Edmonds. Specify camera in the testimony.
If this camera were to take a series of pictures of a man talking, will not the position of the man relative to his background vary slightly from picture to picture, corresponding to the different positions of the lenses?
Yes, it's like the human eye. I mean, it's how we perceive depth. You see, my father intended this machine to reproduce movement in 3 dimensions, stereoscopically.
From 16 points of view? Wouldn't this create a very blurred and jerky image when projected?
Well, the lenses of the projector were arranged to converge on a single point.
My client objects to the whole of the foregoing deposition as immaterial and irrelevant. The witness has admitted that this contraption takes its pictures from 16 points of view. It does so, furthermore, on 2 bands of film. Mr. Edison's claim is for a moving picture camera that takes its pictures from a single point of view through a single lens using a single band of film, which, as I understand it, are the fundamental requirements for the reproduction of a smooth and steady moving image.
Overruled. Mr. Page?
Previous to the time of your father's disappearance, did he construct any apparatus other than this 16-lens camera for the making of moving pictures?
He made a 1-lens camera.
What did he do with this camera?
He made a number of trials with it while I was with him in Leeds, and he projected them on a screen.
Have you any examples of the work produced by this camera?
Well, I have the camera itself.
It's the film we're interested in.
The witness will produce LaPrince Exhibit C.
When were these taken?
On October the 14th, 1888.
When were these taken?
On October the 14th, 1888. I can prove it. My grandmother appears in the picture, and she died 10 days later. It was a Sunday. We had all been to chapel in the morning. Then we had Sunday dinner as usual, and my grandmother seemed perfectly well and happy. In the afternoon, my father asked everyone to come out into the garden for a trial of his new camera. Must have been all too much for her.
Is this the complete series?
No, this is just a part of it. These are portions that I mounted myself. But you can tell that the camera had only 1 lens because the image is steady from frame to frame. And you can tell that they're from a moving picture camera because the figures move forward in every frame.
How do we know that this woman is your grandmother?
Well, because it is her.
I can't see her face.
But that's me in the picture. You see, I was there.
When were you there?
Objection.
Overruled.
When were you there, Mr. LaPrince?
On October the 14th, 1888.
kind of film did your father use in his single-lens camera?
Well, he was always on the lookout for a film that had the qualities of celluloid.
What kind of film did your father use in this camera?
Eastman paper film in long rolls.
How are the pictures taken with the single-lens camera prepared for the projector?
Well, it was very difficult. He didn't have the advantage of celluloid, you see. The paper film from the camera had to be developed into a negative. Then we stripped the negative frames from their paper backing and made a positive transparency from them. These were very flimsy and needed a stronger transparent backing. They would never have survived all the jerking and the heat of the projector otherwise.
What material did he use for this backing?
Well, that was the problem. He tried everything. Gelatin, glass, even animal horn. The difficulty was that none of these would roll without cracking, and only glass was really transparent enough. He had to mount each individual frame onto a specially designed picture belt, which made it all very heavy.
Did your father ever use celluloid?
Oh, yes, yes. He finally got hold of some in 1889. It came in coated sheets, about a foot square.
But not in long rolls.
Well, no, they were not yet available. He had to make up his own.
Did your father ever take out a patent on his single-lens camera?
Well, he intended to take out a separate patent for it, but he assumed that he was covered by his patent for the 16-lens machine.
There's no reference to any single lens here.
Well, you have the American patent, but he did include it in his British patent.
Will you please read it out?
When provided with only one lens, as it sometimes may be, the sensitive film is intermittently operated at the rear of the said lens, which is provided with a properly timed, intermittently operated shutter.
As it sometimes may be. Is that it? Are there no specifications for this single lens camera?
Well, he felt that it could be deduced from his description of the 16-lens machine. I mean, it would be obvious to any mechanic.
Would it? I don't find it obvious.
It's most enigmatical.
Where is your documented proof that this single lens camera worked or even existed?
I can vouch for it. I was there.
The law requires more than your word, Mr. LePrince. That's what a patent is for.
I have the camera downstairs.
When did you return to the United States from Leeds?
In September 1889. Look, I have the camera. I have it here.
Had your return to this country anything to do with your father's single-lens camera?
Well, yes, I came over a few months before he was supposed to come to help my mother arrange for the debut exhibition of his moving pictures.
It was not until September 1890, a full year later, that he disappeared on his way back to New York. What kept him?
I don't know.
Well, surely you wrote to each other.
Yes.
Was he perhaps held up by his experiments?
Yes.
So the machine still needed work?
Well, yes.
They were not yet perfected.
Yes. No, I don't know. An invention is never perfected. There's always room for improvement. The camera is genuine. There are people who saw it. Ask them. There are people who will swear
Order, please.
If your witness has this single-lens camera with him, why can't we see it? We can't be expected to believe his story if he fails to produce it.
The meeting is adjourned to meet upon notice.
I'm very sorry. We just couldn't risk exhibiting it. The patent specifications are simply not detailed enough. They would have accused us of fraud.
But it's genuine.
I'm very sorry.
The United States Circuit Court for the Southern District of New York held on the 25th day of July, 1901. It is ordered, adjudged, and decreed as follows. To wit, that the United States patent granted August 31st, 1897 to the complainant, Thomas A. Edison, is a good and valid patent. That the said Thomas A. Edison was the first and sole inventor of the invention described therein. That the defendant American Mutoscope Company has infringed upon the said patent by making and using motion picture cameras.
Adolf should have shown the court the single-lens camera.
He tried to.
It was too good for them. They conspired to exclude it. We should have had our own lawyers.
I told them I didn't know why he was delayed, but I did know. He was ill. His mechanic was ill. It's just that they confused me. What I meant to say was that he found the projector very difficult. The parts he had constructed for him were badly made, and they had to be done again. The invention is trial and error. Edison knows that. It just takes time. Father was not a rich man. He didn't have Edison's resources. His experiments were very costly, and he had to take on other work to pay for them. That's why he was delayed. He had us all to support. He was worried about you, Mother. His real dream was to have great banks of stereoscopic moving picture projectors. He wanted a vast expanse of screen in 3 dimensions, not some picture postcard, not some peephole machine. He wanted to create something indistinguishable from life. Nothing less would satisfy him. He was too damn perfectionist.
It's one of those things that is hard to say. My grandmother thought that somebody had shot him, but it could have happened just by his cleaning his gun. The gun could have misfired, but she was so keyed to what had happened before. He knew too much. She'd already lost her husband. And all the hope she had for the trial was gone. She was running out of money. Everything just disappeared overnight.
It requires no argument to establish the proposition that failure to produce the apparatus in support of a prior claim is absolutely destructive of the defense. A doubt is thus cast upon the LaPrince son's entire story. He's friendly to the defense, and his interest is to glorify as far as possible the work of his father. There's nothing to the LaPrince story.
This was the last word on LaPrince's achievement for the next 30 years. Then, in 1930, at the time of Marie LaPrince's visit to Leeds to unveil the plaque, the LaPrince claims were advanced once again. The last surviving witness of LaPrince's work in Leeds swore a testimony before the United States consul. Frederick Mason had been LaPrince's joiner 40 years earlier.
Mr. LaPrince, he found the projecting machines much more difficult than the camera. That was the main reason for his delay in going back to New York. It was getting hold of the right kind of film material that was the main problem. The paper film, that was just about all right for the camera, but it was no good at all for projecting. I first met him in 1887, when he came into my father's workshop. I was just 18 at the time and still apprenticed. And he said he wanted a lot of woodwork doing. So I had to make hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of these things for him. He searched high and low to find something lighter. Something that would roll up continuously. It must have been early autumn in 1889, when Mr. LaPrince, he came into the workshop one evening in great spirits. He got hold of some sensitized material called celluloid. I remember it clearly. The sheets were too wide. We had to cut them into strips and then glue them together. But that stuff, it solved his last problem. He were an extraordinary man. Not like how you'd think of an inventor. So gentle and considerate. He stood 6'3" in his socks. A real gentleman. I always said it must have been foul play. I mean, how else can you account for it? He had everything to gain by marketing the thing.
In 1988, the LaPrince story emerged once more. LaPrince's great-grandson, Billy Hittle, was invited from Memphis to Leeds to unveil a second plaque commemorating the centenary of his great-grandfather's achievement.
Where this very important incident took place.
Leeds City Council planned to celebrate this event with a reenactment of LaPrince's early film experiments on Leeds Bridge.
Was this building abandoned at the time that he made his first film?
I think it was an ironmonger's in the basement.
Oh, well, here it is. Camera.
The camera I had a hand in making had one lens. I built the cabinet, and we used Honduras mahogany. I didn't know what it was at first. He only gave me half a plan at a time, so I couldn't give the game away. It was that secretive. He took pictures with it on Leeds Bridge. It was a great success. You could see all the traffic and the horses, just as if you were there yourself. I remember a man lounging on the side of the bridge, and pictures even showed the smoke curling up from his pipe.
I think, you know, being in the family, I guess it's sort of a combination of what we call being spooked out and sort of a genetic deja vu. Now, looking at the camera? Yeah. Okay, Grandpa. Excellent. Ready? Now.
100 years ago, a foreigner came to this country. He settled in Leeds to perform some experiments and devised a remarkable invention. That invention has had an enormous impact on culture all over the world. It's almost a fairy story that today we can welcome the great-grandson of that gentleman who died in the most mysterious and tragic
And I think it's entirely proper that we do have such a monument, and that this building always remain in place to commemorate this. So I understand the best speech is a short speech, so I'll unveil at this time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I wish I'd kept hold of a bit more now. It all got dispersed after he'd vanished, sold for scrap. We just didn't realise its value. I think he poured everything he had into those machines. Don't get me wrong, though. He was just. I got my wages every week, and he paid his accounts.
Before Billy left Leeds, I took him to visit the Whitley family grave.
A few years ago, I had no idea where they were. They were only distant names. In memory of Sarah Robinson, the beloved wife of Joseph Whitley.
It was Lizzie's mother, who had died shortly after the filming in the garden.
Died October 24, 1888.
The date of her death was proof that Adolf had been telling the truth.
Now, they'll stand where they lie.
But he had designed the memorial.
A.L.P.
His signature had survived.
Augustine LaPrince. We hear a lot about roots, and here are mine.
My dear Lizzie, I have your dear letter of the 20th and see with great pleasure that you are all well. The weather has been beautiful. The garden is in full bloom. I send the holly leaf and a rose taken from the bed on the south side of the house. I'm sorry I cannot come and see you all merry and lively this Christmas. It is not to be. I'm bound by my chain for a while longer. It is stupefying to find the amount of forethought every detail requires. Every alteration in one part always brings so many in the others.
According to Lizzie, Le Prince had returned to Leeds in 1887 to avoid New York's industrial spies and to take advantage of her father's offer of support. If her account was to be believed, money was no problem for Le Prince. But some papers I came across in the Leeds City Archive told a quite different story. By some quirk of fate, 2 boxfuls of legal documents had survived from her father's firm, Whitley Partners. They showed that at the time of Le Prince's Leeds moving picture experiments, Whitley was virtually bankrupt and in no position to invest in the idea. I then made an extraordinary find. Hidden among these papers was a writ, served on Le Prince in October 1888, the very month of the camera trials. It was a summons for bad debt. Le Prince owed about £600, the equivalent of £50,000 today. From the notes that someone had scribbled in the corner, it was clear that by the time of his disappearance, 2 years later, he had only paid off £46. With no support coming from Whitley, Le Prince was in deep trouble. His experiments had eaten up all of his resources. A few weeks later, another find came to light. Billy called from Memphis to say that he had found the original documents which Lizzie had based her memoirs on. Among them were several which she seemed to have ignored. They confirmed Le Prince's financial plight.
Dear sirs, we shall be glad to receive your check for the enclosed invoice for the hire of the dynamo, and to hear if you have finished with the machine, so that we can have it back again.
There were also letters from Le Prince, written in the last year of his life, which pointed to the difficulties he was having with his projector.
Leeds, April 11, 1890. Ma bien chérie. A few days more and I will be
with the machine. All going well so far. But there are so many pieces to adjust, it takes an infinity of time.
Leeds, April 18, 1890. I am just reaching the end of the tedious work I was describing in my last,
and therefore getting near the trial, the final, and I trust the successful one. What a relief it will be. I shall scarcely believe it is over after all this anxious tugging, waiting, and trying again.
Piece of celluloid used by Le Prince.
I recognized Lizzie's handwriting. On the face of things, the fragment confirmed Mason's claim that celluloid had solved Le Prince's last problem. But a closer examination suggested the opposite. The celluloid which Le Prince obtained in 1889 was not of a sufficient quality for projection. Le Prince now faced a profound crisis. Dangerously low on resources, he was forced back to experimenting with individual glass and gelatine transparencies. It was a process fraught with difficulty. An attempt at projecting glass slides through a single-lens device failed dismally. The 16-lens projector also proved impractical. He finally settled for a compromise.
My dear Lizzie, I have remodeled the machine, which did not work as well as I wanted. It means a lot of beginning again. All goes well so far. It works almost as well as a sewing machine, multiplied by 3. My dear Lizzie, I had an accident at the belt of the machine yesterday. Lots of pallets that hold the pictures were torn. They'll take much time and patience to refix. It will put back the trial a couple of days. I begrudge it, as time is so precious right now. I have had another go at resetting the picture belt, resetting the whole thing because of the mishap. It's been very slow work. I have been awfully down about it all. Every other part of the machine works well, but there can be no result until the damage is repaired.
I hope to send thee word in my next, and also some cash, which unfortunately I have not yet at hand, and it makes me feel very uneasy.
These Memphis finds confirmed what I had begun to suspect. When Le Prince visited his brother Albert in Dijon in September 1890, the only thing that stood between him and the unspeakable shame of bankruptcy was his share of his mother's inheritance. A telegram, sent to Lizzie from her brother a month after Le Prince's disappearance, indicated that he left Dijon still not knowing when he would receive the legacy.
Albert says Le Prince knows 1,000 pounds due him from the Boulevard estate someday. That's his mother's legacy.
1,000 pounds due him from the Boulevard estate someday.
He has that one horrible theory, one of his brother whacked. Abel, Cain and Abel.
Yeah.
What, do you think his brother might have bumped him off?
That's what I said, that's another theory. When you talk about inheritance, people get mean.
That's right, especially if he was going to go through the inheritance on the camera. And his brother said, "You've already wasted enough money on the damn project. Don't whittle away our inheritance on it." I think that when a man devotes 10 years of his life to a project, and the project is constantly plagued with breakdowns and financial problems, that it comes to a point that he doesn't see a real end to it. Again, I think that the man got off at an obscure train station and walked away and left his family with the mercy that the man was missing and that he was not a failure in the eyes of his children.
Lizzie's desire to point the finger at Edison is very understandable. There can be little doubt that the Edison people plotted ruthlessly to deny Le Prince credit for his single-lens camera. But I found no evidence to suggest that Le Prince had been the victim of kidnap or murder. The reality was probably more painful. Overwhelmed by unmanageable debt, dogged by the lack of a suitable film material, and a projector that would not come right, Le Prince engineered his own disappearance. Adolphe probably came nearest to knowing the truth. Perhaps the spectre of his father's failure was too much for him. the many tragedies which make up the Le Prince story, the most ironic must be his failure to patent his single-lens camera in sufficient detail. According to Adolf, Le Prince intended to take out a separate patent for it. But it seems that events overtook him, and he simply never got round to it. It was a fatal oversight. Within a few years, the technology which he had pioneered with this camera would constitute the mainstream of moving pictures.
My dear Lizzie, I have succeeded in producing the movement of a man walking. I believed I could arrive faster, but each step seems to cost an infinity of trials and tests. But also, each step confirms me in the assurance of an early success. I have satisfied myself that the effect will be perfectly natural.
I closed the book on the Le Prince mystery nearly 25 years ago. I felt that I'd left no stone unturned. Well, one perhaps, because I'd had this niggling feeling that I should have made inquiries at the Paris morgue. But after 10 years on the trail, I felt I'd had enough. Besides, I knew that Lizzie Le Prince had hired private detectives to look into all this at the time of the disappearance, and they'd come up with nothing. Quite recently, another Le Prince sleuth decided to make that Paris morgue trip that I'd failed to do. And amazingly, he stumbled on a photograph of a man fished from the Seine in September 1890 that bore a striking resemblance to Le Prince himself. One of the last photographs of Le Prince alive, taken in 1889, reveals an exhausted, anxious-looking man who seems much older than his 47 years. Set against the image of the dead man in the morgue, it's clear to me that they're one and the same person. So Le Prince drowned in the Seine. Was it murder? Was Edison in some way involved? Was it an accident? None of these, I suspect. Because for me, the harassed and distant look of Le Prince in 1889, smoking a cigarette, probably weighed down by debt and technical problems, still suggests someone at the end of his tether, just one more setback or two away from taking his own life.